Welcome to Bone2Pick. Happy New Year, everybody. I can't think of a better way to kick off 2013 than by sitting down with our featured guest for January, the one and only, the great Chris Botti. I've had the privilege of knowing Chris for almost 30 years now, and he is, without
Good Lord,
question,
time flies.
without question, one of the most inspiring, driven, intelligent, and talented musicians I've ever worked with. He is the #1 selling jazz artist in the world today. He has had 3 #1 selling jazz albums on the Billboard jazz chart. He's received a cluster of Grammy nominations. He's sold over 3 million albums worldwide. And as musicians, we often like to list who we've performed with and toured with. And Chris has reached that rare level where he can list the musicians and artists who have performed and toured with him. And it is an impressive list for sure. It includes Sting, James Taylor, Paul Simon, Herbie Hancock, Steven Tyler, Yo-Yo Ma, Andrea Bocelli, David Foster, Joni Mitchell, just to name a few. He was named one of the 50 most beautiful people by People magazine. He's dated Katie Couric. He has done it all. One of the attributes that I really wanted to say right off the bat that has impressed me about Chris is he's one of those individuals who makes everybody around him better. He brings an energy to everything that he does. And I kind of liken it to sports personalities. You think back to the Larry Bird, Magic Johnson era, and everybody always said those two guys really made everybody on the court better. Same for Chris Botti in terms of musicians. And I know on a personal level, my life and career have been greatly influenced by Chris, and without the association with him, it would have been vastly different. So it's really an incredible attribute that doesn't get mentioned a lot. We are here today in Lower Manhattan at the beautiful Mercer Hotel. Chris is kind enough to invite us into his suite to spend a little time talking about his great career. And I'm reasonably sure you're the only brass player staying here today, and at least the only brass player paying for his own room. Let's put it that way. But it's great to be here. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks,
and really looking forward to talking about your extraordinary life.
Do I have to call you Michael?
Oh, no.
We go so far back, and is it 30 years?
It's almost. I think it's almost. I think 1984 was when we first met. But
man, time flies. It's just crazy.
It has. But Chris, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I wanted to start off by kind of asking you a question that I was thinking of saving to the end of the interview, but I thought about it and I thought it would give us some insight into Chris Botti and would give us an overall kind of viewpoint as we go through the interview. When you look back on your extraordinary career and what you've created in your life, and you look at the challenges that a jazz instrumentalist faces today, what was your game plan in building what has become this incredible career? And specifically, when you've gone through those inevitable difficulties and roadblocks, what was it that kept you going and kept you driven through the whole process?
Well, first of all, I think that when you're on the ride, and you were firsthand with this because we did it together. Like there were gigs that you and I did that paid virtually nothing, and I remember we played in the subway and we played on Fifth Avenue on the street in the cold, and you know what I mean, like gigs that now I wouldn't want to do today, but at the time we thought they were great, and I think that there's something that's inherently good about, if you can scrape up enough money together to pay your landlord. I thought I'd won an Academy Award. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like the naivete part of it acts as to keep you insulated from maybe like being depressed about where you might be in the long picture. But the little tiny goals, we got this gig, we get some horn section gig, we play in this record, we thought it was the greatest, and each one of those little stepping stones leads you to a self of like accomplishment. But if you were to start at the beginning and say, well, how can I arrive from here to here? To young people ask me, well, how can I get a career like yours? And I'm like, I don't know. You need to like you need to be like worried about impressing the guy that's sitting next to you in some section or some in the audience or some band director or whatever it is, and not try to worry about being an international act. It's the small steps that lead to the bigger game. Did I answer your question? I don't know. I can't remember.
Yeah. No, it's a great way to look at it. I think I read an article, an interview in some magazine that you had given, and you talked about how there was no plan B. and that your whole you were driven by this is
Yeah.
what I'm going to achieve,
Yeah.
and I mean I think it speaks to that. Like you take each step and each day, one day, one step at a time.
And also knowing, I mean, in jazz, it's tough because you have a real sense of purity and history that goes along with a lot of the kids and people that want to play jazz music. And I think that for me, I made the conscious decision to know within myself what I didn't want to do. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, I'd like to have this career, but I knew I didn't want to do that. And it's sort of intersected in the sense when I first moved to New York, it was maybe about a year and a half after the whole Wynton Marsalis explosion onto the scene. And somehow I thought to myself, and in hindsight, it was the proper way to look at things, that Wynton, by his incredible, immense talent, was setting up basically a glass ceiling. And no one's going to penetrate that glass ceiling doing Wynton, you know, like trying to outdo Wynton. So you have now like a long litany of people that are following in Wynton's footsteps, which is great, you know. But if you want to like penetrate, have your own kind of sense of self, you better go over here and find your own ceiling, you know, some along those lines, you know. And so I kind of thought to myself, I wanted to release like a very straight ahead, purist jazz record where I'm playing, you know, 15 choruses of All the Things You Are or something. I'm never going to do it like Wynton, so don't try, you know. And so I got into a whole bunch of other range of stuff to try to find the right platform for me as an artist. And that's what I thought in 1985. I didn't even make my first record till 10 years after that. So I think like in your gut, you need to kind of know where you need to go, and then along the way, you need to be very, very kind of focused and single-minded in your day-to-day goals, rather than letting the overall goal kind of like bowl you over and like take bad precedent.
That's great piece of advice. Let's take a step back and look at your formative years. I know you grew up in Oregon. You spent some time in Italy as a youngster. You went to Indiana University where you studied with David Baker, the great Bill Adam. I know you also studied with Woody Shaw, and maybe you could also, along the same lines, touch on some of the influences. I mean, you've alluded to them, but I know Tom Harrell was an influence. I know Miles, of course, was a big influence, Freddie Hubbard. But maybe if you can share some of your thoughts about that time of your life.
Well, I grew up in Oregon, and there's nothing to do in Oregon, you know. So there's nothing to do in Indiana either. So I guess I just practiced, and you know, and I think that those, especially Indiana University, as opposed to other schools like Berkeley or Juilliard, where a kid that comes to Juilliard, you know, they're worried about like paying the rent and how they deal with the subway, you know, like. And in hindsight, again, you know, having gone to Indiana, there was nothing to do except practice, you know, and there was a camaraderie amongst the Bill Adams students there that really applauded people practicing, you know. So we were in there 8, 9 hours, 10 hours. I mean, it was all day long practicing the foundation, which to this day, every day I wake up and just go, thank God I met Mr. Adam, and was exposed to his style of teaching. But for trumpet players, you know, you're only going to go to a few great trumpet players. You named 4 of them right there, you know. But for me, I heard Miles Davis's My Funny Valentine album from his 4 and More concert, and when I was 12, and I heard that, and I went like, my God, I mean, my life changed, because I was familiar with Doc, and I was familiar with Maynard and Al Hurt and Louis Armstrong, and that the way that they played like a very joyous kind of like reaching bravado sound, and then I heard this radically different thing, this brooding kind of melancholy, and the sound kind of went inward, you know, and it resonated with me, and I thought, at that moment, I thought I want to be a trumpet player for the rest of my life. I didn't think about all this, but I thought about a connection to this instrument, you know. And in the weirdest twist of fates, I was invited to the White House last year to perform for the Obamas and the Clintons and the Carters, and they invited myself and Herbie Hancock to play My Funny Valentine. So, I mean, like a weird just, I mean, what are the odds that, you know,
that's awesome.
The whitest guy to ever play the trumpet arrives at the White House to like play with Herbie Hancock, who made that song, you know.
Yeah, oh, that's an awesome story. Yeah, I had heard that Randy Brecker actually had told me that he was going down to, was involved in some way, and that you were playing with Herbie, so that was, I vicariously got a lot of enjoyment
and
out of it.
the funniest things, we got to the sound check, and and Herbie said, well, so how do you want to do My Funny Valentine? I was like, Herbie, that's like playing horse with Michael Jordan. And he goes, well, what do you want me to stand? I don't know what. You post up, I'll tell you. You're Herbie Hancock. You play the way you invented it.
Yeah. You take the shot. Go ahead. No, I'm good. I'm good. Well, as we talked about, I had the very, very good fortune of meeting Chris in 1984 when he joined Buddy Rich's band. It was a particularly good time for Buddy's band because we were backing up Frank Sinatra on various concerts quite a bit back then. And I remember when Chris joined the band, he was a young guy. Chris has always looked amazing and had this youthful appearance even now. And back then he looked very young, and everybody was kind of wondering, oh, what's this guy going to be like? And he totally bowled everybody over, and it was clear that he had an immense amount of talent as a very young man. And
I couldn't play out of the staff.
Au contraire, I remember you many times playing out of the staff. But I remember thinking, you're humble and you're very nice about your description of yourself. But I remember thinking at the time that you had something great within you and greatness. And it's probably a handful of people that I've met in my life that I felt that way about. But Chris, maybe you could just share some thoughts about that time of your career when it's just getting going, and in particular what it was like playing with Mr. Sinatra back at that time.
Well, that was fun. My time with Buddy, however, wasn't so great. I get here again, you learn what you don't want to do. I was forever kind of jilted into maybe recognizing that playing in a big band was not my thing. Mm-hmm. The Sinatra gig, well, you did many, many gigs with Sinatra, but the ones that we did with Sinatra, I think it was like a 10-day run or something like that at the Universal Amphitheater. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Back when it was an open-air theater, I believe. And it was I literally dropped out of Bad Message for Kids, stay in school. But I left school in the middle of my fourth year, went right to Los Angeles, got off the plane, and there we were at soundcheck. And that night, there's Quincy Jones and Angie Dickinson and all the movie stars of the day, and out walked Sinatra, and we did that show, and his voice was fantastic. They were doing In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning, Guess I'll hang my tears out to dry, and with that orchestra, and it was really, really great. And then subsequently, we went on I only lasted 5 weeks or something like that with Buddy, doing a regular tour across the country, and boy, that was an experience.
Reality sets in. More like depression sets in after the Sinatra event.
I think Buddy liked a more super, super traditional kind of Big Spiderbeck influenced trumpet player, which at the time, being a kind of idealistic college kid, I was into Woody Shaw and Tom Harrell and kind of a little more esoteric stuff. Which maybe now, if I was doing that gig, I would have a different viewpoint on it. Mm-hmm. But at the time, I was like, anyhow, Buddy and I probably weren't the best of friends,
Well, I think it's a long list that wasn't the best of friends with Buddy, but it's interesting perspective, and obviously your taste in playing served you well as you went forward. You moved to New York in 1985, mm-hmm. and you began working almost immediately as a studio musician. And once again, I was fortunate to be called by Chris and a mutual friend of ours. They were forming a horn section, Chris along with a gentleman named Kent Smith, who's a great friend of ours, great musician, great trumpet player. And they formed a horn section which became known as the New West Horns, and featured Chris and Kent along with a fabulous saxophone player, one of the best of our generation, a gentleman named Andy Stitzer, and myself on trombone. And we were, largely because of Chris. He was kind of a catalyst to the whole section, both musically and the business side of it. And we went on to record with Bob Dylan and Roger Daltrey, and we had our little heavy metal run there with Twisted Sister and Winger and Rat and Aretha Franklin, Scritti Politti, The System. We did quite a bit of TV work. Chris ended up meeting a gentleman named Ed Kalehoff, who was a great arranger and composer, and had written a lot of music, including stuff for Monday Night Football and ABC Sports, various news themes. Anyway, Chris, can you kind of talk about that time in your life? It seemed like you went from getting here to doing studio work really quickly, and a lot of us benefited from that, and you kind of brought us along in the whole thing. Well,
when we were in college, and our generation, we looked to the generation before us, and there was a really great template that was set up, and that basically melted down to this. It was like these incredible musicians that were artists that would also become like very notable sidemen, and they were doing studio work, and they would include David Sanborn, Michael Brecker, Richard T., Steve Gadd, Jerry Hay, and all the West Coast guys, Randy Brecker, of course, Lou Soloff, and so when we arrived and our generation came here to play music, there was a template already set up of people you could look up to and say, well, how can we do that, you know? And I just always thought, like, I really admired what Randy Brecker and what Jerry Hay did, you know, in their individual styles and the way they approached horn section. And I thought there would be a way for us to break into the scene. And I remember the first couple of years, everyone saying, oh, no, it can't be done. It'll never be done. And I think that by us being sort of open to working with younger bands or acts that didn't know, I mean, I think a lot of times acts, even famous acts, they get intimidated, like, well, what do we do with horns? Well, we'll just get our friend from high school to play some horns. They don't really know, like, you know, like horn playing is as much about, you know, a craft thing as a drummer. You know, like these bands will spend all the money on the drummer and they'll spend no time thinking about the horn section, you know. And so I think what we brought is accessibility. So we'd work well with the artists, like people like David Frank from The System, or even Arif Mardin when he was here. We miss him very much. And so we worked well with those kind of people, and also we brought, you know, kind of youthful energy and stuff like that. And probably of all the people that you and I worked with, Ed Kalehoff was the guy that became kind of our entree back into the mainstream of studio work, because there was a little window there of maybe 5 or 6, 7 years where we were doing 1, 2 really big orchestra, brass, powerful horn section days, and sometimes they'd be 4 hours long, sometimes they'd be 17 hours long. Remember those, like Wide World of Sports?
Absolutely.
There'd be 108 different pieces of music that we'd have to do long before they had Pro Tools and put it all together. You know, we'd have to play each edit in, right? And so you learned, you know, over that course of time, you'd see how records were made. We were witnessing firsthand how great producers like Arif Mardin and David Frank would make records, and then we'd go see how great orchestra stuff was put together, like with Ed Kalehoff, and it kind of gave us respect from the older guy, the older you know, the older crew, you know. And so we had, all of a sudden, I was sitting in sessions all the time with Randy Brecker and Lou Soloff, and it was really a fun, super fun time. And you know, we used to come out of those sessions just flying high. It was great. It was so fantastic. And here again goes back to my original thing, you know, like you become fascinated with what you're doing, and you try to put your all into it. And we did that, and I think we served our clients really well.
Wow, well said. Yeah, I certainly remember, and I'll never forget some of those 12, 14, 17-hour dates with Ed. It was just, but it kept
our
going.
Friends,
it was
we'd have to hire other musicians, and I remember the first time, like, maybe it was Lou or something, they come in and go, or Alan Rubin, you know, Alan was very funny at the, and he'd come in and go, we're going to do how many? What? I mean, and we were crazy. We would have, you know, we didn't care. We just wanted to work, and we wanted to be a part of it, and we wanted to feel like we had our place in the studio world, because the studio world was vibrant. It was the next step if you could be in the studio world. And once I got known in the studio world, then the next thing you know, Paul Simon's looking for a musician, and he asks for a recommendation of who's, you know, the new trumpet guy on the block, and they knew me from the studio world, and Lenny Pickett was the guy that recommended me, and David Torn, the guitarist, and they both recommended me, and bang, the next thing I know, I'm in Paul Simon's band standing next to Michael Brecker for a year and a half. You know, so everything has its little, you know, place in the way that it fits in the Rubik's Cube, you know, to make it work.
Well, that leads me right into what I was going to ask you. Can you talk a little bit about how your relationship with Paul has evolved over the years? I know you spent that time touring. And then at the same time, I know you became close with Michael Brecker, the late, great Michael Brecker. You became close both musically and personally, I think, through Paul's gig. Can you talk about maybe the impact that Michael had on you?
Well, a nicer person in the world there isn't. And it just happened to intersect with one of the greatest saxophone players ever, you know, along with John Coltrane and a handful of others. You know, the list is very, very short. But the humble kind of gentleman side of Michael is something that really, I think, people remember. I stood next to him when he was the featured soloist in Paul Simon's group. So he took the gig to not only because he was friendly with Paul, but to walk out on stage when Paul took a break, so he could get Paul's audience to find out about Michael. And even amongst all that, you know, and I'm sure he was being paid a fortune, and I was being paid just what, you know, a starting guy gets paid. He never made me feel like, he always made it feel like he stood in the section next to me, and never made me feel like, oh, I'm this, you know, celebrity saxophonist and you're just a peon. You know, he was never like that at all, and he was never like that with anyone. And yet when he walked to the stage and played the saxophone, everyone was like, okay, check. You know, and it's just that's, you know, he was always gracious and wonderful, and that's what I really remember mostly about Michael, and complimentary about Herbie's that way too in a lot of respects, you know. But they both had that very sense of humbleness, and they compliment other people often.
That's great stuff.